Welcome to tonight's ZFA conversation. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking with you tonight from the lands of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands on which people are watching this. The ZFA conversation is brought to you from the ZFA. The Zionist Federation of Australia is the elected federal roof body in the Australian Jewish community of all Zionist organisations and activities in Australia. It aims to create a thriving and strong Australian Jewish community with an unshakable bond to Israel. The ZFA has an emphasis on connection, advocacy, and representation. And the ZFA conversations are our way to connect global experts on a range of topics relevant to Israel and the Jewish world with our community here in Australia. Tonight, as you can see from my smiling face, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Fania Oz-Salzberger. Fania knows our community very well, having spent a huge amount of time here, especially teaching at Monash University. Fania is an Israeli writer, history professor, public intellectual. She's Professor Emerita at the University of Haifa Law School, and she's previously taught at Princeton and Munich University, as well as our own Monash University, of course. Her field is the history of political thought, and her books include Jews and Words, which is co-authored with Amos Oz. As you will discover over the next hour, Fania is a strongly Zionist progressive Israeli who deeply loves her country, and she's also alive to its many challenges and divisions. She's a nuanced defender of Zionism and the Jewish state to those on the progressive side of politics who may unfairly criticise Israel. So we'll get going, Fania, now that I've introduced you. A lot of the people watching don't need any introduction. And I wondered if we can start on that question of nuance, and if you could share with us a reflection about those on the left who maybe used to share many values with you until the 7th of October, and on their relationship with Jewish communities and with Israel since then, and where it leaves you.
Yes, hello everyone. Hello Adele. Thanks to Bren and to Jeremy for organizing this webinar. I'm very glad to be in Australia now for an hour and for about an hour. I miss it and I love it, especially the Aussie Jewish community. So since we are talking about nuance, I will take issue with one aspect of the way I was defined by you, Adele. Thank you for the introduction, which was lovely. I do not call myself a progressive and never have, because I think that the term has been taken over by an extreme left, which is not me. I'm a liberal, always have been. I'm a kibbutznik by birth, so a social democrat by education, a liberal by creed, and a Zionist humanist. We will get back to Zionist humanism perhaps later in the conversation. And therefore, in the immediate, horrible, traumatic, bloody aftermath of the 7th of October, I did not have to go through any process of alienation or distancing with the global, what is now called the global left, because I'm not part of that global left. There is another substantial group of people in the world, which is not as vocal, noisy, not, unfortunately, not heard as often as it should, of the moderate left, of the those who know the old style social democrats, many of them in Australia as well, which is a political opinion that went hand in hand with Zionism for many, many decades. In fact, as we may recall, the mainstream of Zionism, the founding fathers and mothers of the state of Israel, have been social democrats, part of the labor movement, which was bigger and more nuanced than we now know, Ben-Gurion, rivals of Ben-Gurion. But this has been and still is a moderate left worldview. which is about democracy and liberalism, which is about social justice in ways that change as you interpret global situations as we go along. I am not part of the kind of left wing that now stomps around with identity politics, with the victimization of the global South and the demonization of the global North, with dividing the world into victims and perpetrators, into the conquered and the settlers. I'm not a post-colonialist. I think this is a very dangerous aberration. And all these opinions in my mind, which are utterly unnuanced and have gone into the huge anti-Israeli tsunami that took place immediately, by the way, after the 7th of October, long before Israel tried to strike back at Gaza. This anti-Israel tsunami has to do with a post-colonialist misinterpretation of the world and of Israel and of Palestine, which I'm not part of. So I think that we have now set the record straight on what kind of a lefty I am. And the definition within Israeli politics would be a moderate Zionist left.
And can I ask you on that, do you feel like after like the events of the 7th of October, considering that you feel like you were never part of what you just described in the first place, but for yourself and where you and your values and your life view and your life, do you feel like the 7th of October influenced your opinions and where you are now?
Adele, let me say a few personal things. Here I am sitting with the yellow for the hostages and of course the hostage token on my neck, as it is in every public appearance, in every country or every Zoom I take part in. I am not an objective player, a neutral participant. I am one of the people badly hit by the 7th of October, also personally. Some beloved friends and family members have lost loved ones. I was not directly bereaved. I was second circle to some horrible bereavements, horrible stories. The whole thing doesn't leave anyone unscathed, and certainly not a person who grew up in a kibbutz and personally knew a lot of people who were there at that horrible day. So obviously it has changed me. You know, sometimes people ask me if I'm post-traumatized. And my answer is, I wish I were post-traumatized, but I'm not post. We are being traumatized as we go along by the ongoing war, by the horrible, sorry about that. I have two Zionists at home who insist on taking part in all of my webinars. They are very deeply involved. But I will go on. We are all still within trauma. And not least because of what's going on within Israeli politics, and we'll have to talk about that too. This is very much part of the story and part of the ongoing trauma. There is the Lebanon-Hezbollah situation ongoing. You know, we are all looking today at the successful Israeli aerial raid of the Yemen port, the Houthis, and this is the kind of good old IDF that we knew and admired for being able to retaliate so well, so quickly, pinpointing the enemy targets so well. This is more like a usual, normal, you know, if you can call a war normal kind of warfare. But Gaza is not normal. And the Hezbollah situation is not normal. And the fact that these terrorist needles are hiding in civilian haystacks is not normal. And the fact that some of the civilians are supporting the terrorists actively, but are still obviously, of course, included in the international conventions about having to defend civilians in time of war. All this is deeply abnormal. And Israeli politics is in the worst place it ever was historically. So all this is affecting me personally in more ways than one. And within my specific political views, I have not changed my commitment to the kind of solution I believe is still achievable. We will talk about it, the two-state solution. But I'm not going to use the word peace in the foreseeable future. It's too beautiful a word to abuse when talking about Israel and Hamas or Hamas's supporters. We have to talk about an agreement. We have to talk about a ceasefire pending, of course, the release of the hostages. We have to talk about a longer regional view, and we have to talk about territorial compromise. We do. We have no choice. I wish we did, but we don't. But I'm not going to mention the beautiful word peace for the time being. Maybe later, maybe in a generation, maybe in a decade.
I feel like that in itself is a departure of some kind from before the 7th of October. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you will feel very comfortable, but I feel that some of what you're bringing in Israel at the moment might be a harking back of messages maybe from your father's generation. That's what it feels like to me. So I feel like saying you're not going to use the word peace now is a significant departure, I think, from those messages.
Well, it's not a departure from the pragmatics. Look, yeah. we have to put some things in order. There are really two kinds of left, and it's not only about progressivism or wokeness, but it's also a question of being acquainted with the situation and with human nature and the region, our part of human nature, to be pragmatic and realistic. And the kind of left I grew up with, my father, his friends, the people most of the people in the Peace Now movement, and many others, belongs to the more pragmatic left. And I want to remind you that pragmatism is a value of Zionism. Pragmatism is Herzl, neither a lefty, not a righty, but a wonderful centrist, that Herzl called becoming part of the family of nation and being aware and assisted by the world power balance, the world's powers, not ignoring them. A non-messianic pragmatic viewpoint was always a part of mainstream Zionism. And the pragmatic left, led among others by my father, by my late father, Amos Oz, embraced the two-state solution back in the 1970s onwards, not long after the Six-Day War, not long after the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, 1970s onwards. There is another left in Israel and abroad, the starry-eyed left. This is not about identity or progressivism. This is about being starry-eyed about the constellation of the stars in our region. They said, why not have one state for both Israelis and Palestinians? And mind you, I'm not talking about the Palestinian citizens of Israel or the Arab Israelis, whichever way they prefer to call themselves, it's up to them. They are part of Israel. I'm talking about Israel and a future Palestine, or one happy state for both Israelis and Palestinians. And this starry-eyed notion was diagnosed by the pragmatic left as a mistake as early as the 1970s or 80s. Because I was very young when I started demonstrating against the earliest settlements. I was 17 in my first demonstration. We never thought that we can live as one big happy family with the Palestinians, not with all of them, yes, with the Israeli Arab citizens who have proven their worth in so many ways in the recent months, but not with the radicalized hate-mongering kind of leaderships, and of course the active terror organizations around the Palestinian world, unfortunately also in much of the Palestinian diaspora. We cannot suddenly become one happy family, living in one shared house. I will not be a fellow citizen of the Gazan Nukhba brigades who carried out the 7th of October. I will not be a fellow citizen in one state with any of the civilians who cheered them on. So a two-state solution was for us the pragmatic response to the starry-eyed ideal that people are still pending these days all over the social media of having one big Judeo-Palestinian or Palestino-Jewish state. As my father loved saying, and I quote him, "Make peace, not love." There is not too much love. I've got some wonderful Palestinian friends whom I love, in Israel and outside Israel. But the people are not ready, not in this generation, maybe not in the next, to cohabit one civil society. Ergo, in the absence of any other solution, peaceful solution, bloodless solution, we need two states, not one.
Can you talk a little bit? I heard you used the word hope recently instead of optimism, and I feel like it's very relevant to the pragmatism you've been talking about just now. And I wondered if you can explain a little bit about why you would prefer to talk about hope rather than pessimism or optimism.
Well, a Palestinian friend, an intellectual, once told me that hope is part of his toolbox. I like that definition very much. Hope is a working tool. Optimism is the color of your glasses. But hope is a working tool. You can use it. You can use it especially with and for young people who are naturally, almost biologically hopeful. By the way, that Palestinian friend still alive and well, but he has lost hope, like other moderate Palestinians have, for reasons pertaining to both sides, by the way. But I still hold hope in my toolbox because I think that we need, if you want another word beginning with an H, we need a horizon, even if this horizon is a generation away or decades away. My horizon is the two-state solution. It's not a pink horizon. It's not a lovely, smooth horizon. It's not a fuzzy, huggable horizon. But this is what I'm working for. This is my hope. And of course, from the Israeli perspective, I don't know what kind of Palestine will emerge. It's up to them as long as it's safe from our viewpoint. But for Israel, I've got high hopes of not getting back the good old Israel I grew up in. I loved the good old Israel I grew up in, but it also had its weaknesses and it had its failures and blind spots. I would like an Israel which is truly future-orientated in a non-messianic way, a secular way, in a national way, but not nationalist, in a way that will allow all the creative forces of this essentially liberal society, essentially modern society, to rush forward. And this Israel is within the scope of my hope.
I feel like since you've been talking about that, now is a good time to ask you about the article you wrote about Humanist Zionism. And although I only read it after the 7th of October, I think maybe you wrote it beforehand. You'll be able to let me know. But it certainly resonated, and I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about that choice of those choice of words, especially because you've been talking about the good old Israel, and I think you know Australia very well, and a lot of us here were brought up in youth movements and with the kind of old labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism and the old categories. And so the idea of having a humanist Zionism, of having another category, is, I think, really interesting, especially for our community.
Well, I'm also a youth movement girl and guide, and pre-army service year, my youth movement was the kibbutzim youth movement, חטיבת בני הקיבוצים, part of הנוער העובד והלומד, which is the Israeli equivalent of Dror Habonim. So if anybody in the audience is from Dror Habonim, you are my fellow idealists. But of course, other wonderful youth movements, both for teenagers and also for people in their 20s, exist both in Australia and in Israel. Right now, by the way, in Israel, I want you to know that we have a kind of a renaissance of youth organizations, movements, both political and social idealists. I want to mention Yahav, which is right now making a headway in Australia. We have some mutual friends at it. This package of ideals is Zionist. It comes from labor Zionism, but right now we need other terms to address the current situation. You can call it liberal Zionism if you release the word liberal from all sorts of superfluous contents and simply say that liberal means that we believe in human dignity and freedom and equality. This is liberal, more or less, in human rights, in civil rights, in being honest to goodness, fair to each other as much as we can beyond national lines. This is liberal. So liberal Zionist movements and organizations. But I am trying to redefine Zionism for the current world audience, which has become very hostile. And I wrote this piece for Moment magazine after the 7th of October. You know, on the 7th of October, I was hiking in India. I scrambled to find a flight, or flights were canceled to get back home. I immediately switched my Twitter account to English only. I used to tweet in Hebrew, a lot of inner Israeli politics. I have been posting in English ever since. And I found out what you all found out, or those of you unfortunate enough to be on the social networks found out, which is that so much of the world, especially the social media world and the youngsters, have turned anti-Israel and anti-Zionism. And it took me a while, first of all, to understand that some people want Israel to disappear completely and equate Zionism to what have you, colonialism or genocide or Nazism. They don't mince their words, nor are they choosy. And to these people, I didn't have much to say, except, am I allowed to say something rude on a webinar? Not sure, you can say, fuck you, Israel is not going anywhere. And Zionism is not going anywhere. And I'm not going to quit using the word Zionism because you have decided to demonize it or to satanize it. But what, yes, we need to single out. And this is something I also want to say to my Australian friends, because I'm following the situation in Australia. And I know how hard it is to be Jewish in general, let alone a Zionist or a friend of Israel. And I've seen some of what's going on, and I've heard from friends some of what's going on. So first of all, let me put everything aside and say that I want to hug you. And I want to, Israelis are now a little bit busy with other things. We're not looking around. We're not looking at what's happening in the Jewish communities worldwide. I want to give a big hug to Jewish communities worldwide, and specifically to my Australian audience today, and to say that I know how hard it must be. Although you know that this is not triggered solely by Israel, this has been lying underground for so very long, it was waiting for any trigger to explode on the surface. What I try to do, and here I'm closing, I'm tying the threads with what I said before. which is also an advice to my Australian friends, is to single out those people outside in the world, non-Jews, sometimes Jews, who are not anti-Semitic and still critical of Israel, maybe very critical, and maybe unacquainted with all the historical facts of Zionism. And maybe they bought some easy mottos and formulas from the discourse and are using them. And try to nuance the situation for them, for the worthy interlocutors, for the people we can argue with and they still legitimize our existence as Jews, as Israelis, as Zionists. And this is where humanist Zionism comes in. Because humanist Zionism is quite simply, and maybe we'll expand later, but I will be very simple about it, the core definition of Zionism, which is that Jews are entitled to their own nation state in part of their ancestral land, like every other nation. It is a universalist statement. It has to do with the liberal nationhood idea of the 19th and early 20th century. It is not nationalistic. It doesn't hate the other. It doesn't think that we are better, except perhaps for the moral duties we voluntarily take upon ourselves, but we're not better than other people. It's not Jews versus Goyim. We have friends in the world. We have fellow travelers in the world. This is Herzl. We have allies. We need to find allies, stick with them and hear their advice. We need to aspire to the basic values of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. This is no longer Herzl, this is Ben-Gurion and his colleagues in the Yishuv and early Israel leadership. And those wonderful jurists, I once wrote some, co-authored a research about them, those Jewish jurists that were educated mainly in German universities and came to Israel to found our judiciary, our Supreme Court, and some of them also helped to word the Declaration of Independence, which is humanist, universalist, calling for and committing to equal rights to Jews and Arabs within Israel, and to everybody else, by the way, regardless of sex, regardless of orientation, regardless of any other differences. And of course, holding out a hand of peace to our neighbors around us. This is the Declaration of Independence today. It could be considered, it is considered a very lefty document. We use it in our demonstrations against the current government of Israel, the pro-democracy protest. Now, we might disagree about that, but the Declaration of Independence is the kind of Zionism and humanism I want to live by. So in the article I wrote, it was especially intended either for young Jewish people or for Jewish people who do not know the historical facts, and for non-Jewish, non-anti-Semites, for people who are critical but not hateful, to understand what core Zionism has been about. Not the Zionism of today's ultra-nationalists in the Israeli government, but the Zionism of my kibbutz, of my 4 grandparents, 2 in the socialist left and 2 in the revisionist right. The humanist Zionism that was shared by the whole mainstream until the last 20 or 30 years. That's the Zionism that I adhere to and would like to rebuild and to announce to a global audience.
Can I ask you on that, an extension of that is about criticizing Israel from a place of love. So it is sometimes, it is the nuance that you can hear the same criticism knowing it's from a place of love for Israel and its democratic character, for Israel and the fact that it should exist. And sometimes you can hear similar comments, but you know that they're coming from a place of anti-Semitism, even accidental anti-Semitism, where people are just kind of following along and don't understand. So where do you differentiate between that, the intention of the criticism for Israel, and how would you, you talked about advice for Australia. So in terms of domestically within a Jewish community here, in terms of domestically in Israel, and also on the international stage?
Well, there are several very clear tests, like litmus tests in chemistry, that I've known to be effective. First of all, anyone identifying Jews per being Jews with Israel is a latent or an open anti-Semite. Being Jewish doesn't mean anything about one's attitude to Israel, as we know, and legitimately so. I've got Jewish friends who are not Zionists, who are not interested in Israel. Fine, they're still Jewish, and they have a Jewish identity, self-referral, and I respect that. So, spraying a graffiti on the monument of Anne Frank in Amsterdam that says Gaza is deeply anti-Semitic. Moreover, the people who don't understand what's wrong with spraying Gaza on Anne Frank, it's a protest, are anti-Semitic even if they don't know it. They are latently anti-Semitic. There is no way in which you identify things Jewish with things Israeli on an automatic pilot without being latently anti-Semitic. That's one test. And the second test is more specific. When you argue with someone about the Israel-Palestine situation, and I've mentioned before, but this is now as a test, ask them what they think of the two-state solution. Even if you yourself don't accept it, never mind, do it as an exercise. Ask them, what do they think about the two-state solution? If they answer, no, 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 Israel doesn't have a right to exist per se, we have slipped down the slope from mere Israel critique to anti-Israelism, anti-Semitism. You can be anti-Israel in the sense that you are deeply critical of its government. You can be anti-Israel in the sense that you have disliked what we have been doing for the last 50 or 60 years. That's okay. We can deal with that. This is an argument, a deep political argument. But to withdraw Israel's right to exist, or to say that it never had it in the first place, which is not just historical ignorance, it's worse. This is anti-Semitism, because this says that nation states have a right to their countries. You don't even discuss that, the very discussing of the question whether France has a right to, French has a right to France, and France has a right to exist, is not on anyone's table. Or Greece. 100 years ago, the Greeks ethnically cleansed every single Muslim resident of Greece and sent them to Turkey, and vice versa, by the way. Is anybody claiming that Greece has no right to exist, according to the famed post-colonialist discourse? So if anyone tells you that Israel hasn't got a right to exist from the very start, or has, some people say, has lost the right to exist today, specifically after the 7th of October, which is doubly cruel, you can look at them in the face and say that they are probably anti-Semitic, whether they know it or not. The singling out and the abandoning of the rights of the Jews to their own liberal democratic nation state. I've tried and tested this all over in my conversations and Zoom conversations and on the social media. It works every time. However, the caveat, also knowing the situation in Australia, anyone who is not doubting Israel's right, but seriously doubting its policies, may well be a legitimate political rival or interlocutor, partner to conversation. So do not throw out the legitimate debate with the dirty waters of anti-Semitism. Single out what is anti-Semitic and beyond debate, and what is legitimately critical of Israel and well within legitimate debate.
Do you feel like there is a place for renewal from Israel that you've been talking about, renewal within Israel, either in the future or even in mid-trauma? Do you feel like there is a role or a place for people outside of Israel, either the diaspora jury or international players? Does anyone else have a role?
Yes, and unfortunately now more than ever, I always thought that the Jewish world has a role and a voice and a place within Israeli discourse, and that we Israelis have a role and a voice and a place within Jewish discourse elsewhere. This is what I've been calling our network of cousinhood. And there is a network of cousinhood, a beautiful one. When I first came to Australia, let me just say as an anecdote, that people looked so familiar to me and felt so close to me that I said to them, hey guys, hey mates. In America, when I meet Jews, I feel they are my second cousins, but with you guys, you are my first cousins. There is a sense of closeness. There's also, by the way, a physical, sociological closeness of first cousinhood between Israeli and Australian Jews. So yes, there is a lot of place for an input in the global Jewish world, and a totally different story here, not cousinhood, but a different kind of participation from the non-Jewish world, from Israel's friends abroad. And I want to dwell on that for a minute, because we never could have created the state of Israel, set it up, got it through the international legal procedure, the United Nations as it then was. The truce after the independence war in 1949, the international community was a founder of the state of Israel, no less than its own founders. We need our international friends. We need to hear their voice, to heed their advice. And since I think we did not, we meaning my government, did not heed their advice for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, we might now need their actual intervention. We might now need their hands-on participation. We do need their hands-on participation in what's going on between us and the Palestinians. For example, just hang on a minute, please. I will mute myself for a second. Sorry about that. There is a lot of good things going in my home, but I need to ask them to tone down a little bit. We need their intervention. Giving you the most practical example. We will have to sort out the Gaza situation, not by flattening and resettling Gaza with Jews, as the more extreme right factor in my government is saying now, and the Prime Minister being silent about it. We will need to sort out the Gaza situation with the help of our best friends and some other friends. United States, maybe the European Union, maybe NATO, maybe quite possibly, even hopefully, Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states. The latter being there on the ground with policing forces until that Gaza can be de-radicalized and maybe ruled by a non-genocidal faction. I'm not in love with Fatah, with the PLO, who are ruling the West Bank, totally not in love with them. I'm disappointed by their leadership. I'm disappointed by the post-Arafat abandoning of the Oslo process. Yes, but I still think that they are the least of evils right now. So we need an international participation in setting that up. We need to live, to exist, to survive the day after. And just the way Israel is not going anywhere, Gaza is not going anywhere either, or the West Bank. I hope that the Hamas and Hezbollah are going away for good, not because we can kill each and every one of them and the ideologies too. You cannot kill an ideology. But in order to push them back into the holes they came out of, into the margins of Palestinian society. This should be doable. And as to the Jewish community, my beloved Jewish community in Australia, maybe you would like us to expand, I don't know, but I'm saying, please open up, nasty as it might seem to you, to the actual argument within Israel. Yes, the political argument. Do not shy away from it. It's very, very, very strong these days. It's brutal, it's impolite to an extreme. It is heartbreaking, but it is a real argument within Israel. So far, thankfully, with very little physical violence. What little there is comes usually, unfortunately, from the police in its current state in Israel against the demonstrators, including my own son. But please get into this argument. Whether you have been traditionally right or left or center or national or liberal, please understand what we are arguing about and then make up your mind and be part of that conversation, that debate. We need to have it. It's not sinat chinam, it's not for no reason. It's exactly like almost 2,000 years ago with the demise of the Second Temple, a real argument, in my view, between messianics and pragmatics. Please enter the conversation. You are not just allowed to enter it, you are invited to enter it and to see what's going on here.
I feel like we chatted beforehand and you had been really open that you think it is really important that diaspora Jewish communities engage with, in your words, with the rift in Israeli community. And I feel like you're being gentle with us, which is appreciated because you're one of us. And I wondered, you had commented that calls for unity are sometimes a problem and politicized. So do you want to share any more about what it is that you would like us to engage in?
I would like to see up close what the protests on the streets of Israel are about. They're obviously, first of all, about this, the hostages, and the adjoining ceasefire in Gaza. They're about the utter need to repair the Lebanon situation, but this you would agree to, of course. And whether it has to be done by war against Hezbollah, we say go ahead. But it's also about the absence of a government, a clear stated government policy for the day after, both in Gaza and in Israel. It's about what we have been seeing for the year before the 7th of October as a growing assault against Israel's judicial institutes, separation of powers, and democracy. It is about our fear of racism being legislated with the judiciary weakened and unable to stop it. Racism also against Israeli citizens who are Arab. There's already such legislation in place and there's more coming. It is about the accommodation of the most extreme factors in Israel's society. The Kahanists, Rabbi Kahana's disciples, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, to take center stage in a coalition government which is malfunctioning, which has malfunctioned before and certainly after the 7th of October. And most of us, the demonstrators, I would like to put it as clearly as I can to this audience, are not raving lefties. They are raging middle-of-the-road Israeli citizens. Center-left, center, moderate right. All of us are marching in those rallies because we think that we have been betrayed, not in the criminal sense of treason, but betrayed morally and politically by our government, both before and after the 7th of October. And I want to add here, when I spoke about my kind of left never supported Hamas. Hamas was the enemy, the worst enemy. Ever since it came into being and started making its voice heard in the early 1990s before Rabin was assassinated. It was also very powerfully against Hamas while he was trying to negotiate with the PLO, with Fatah. And the reason why Benjamin Netanyahu, and we have to mention that, and we have to mention his name, and I think he's the worst thing that happened to Israel since 1948 or before. The reason why he nurtured Hamas and pumped Gulf money, Kuwaiti money and other, into Gaza, and upheld Hamas all the way, a few token occasional response to bombardments, but upheld Hamas all the way until the 7th of October, was that he did not want a more moderate Palestinian leadership to emerge in Gaza or in the West Bank and take up the two-state solution. This is not an analysis, Adele. This is a fact. We need to engage with it, and I invite you to engage with it. And I want you to know that most of Israeli civil society is not every Israeli, it's those who are active, those who care, those who are citizens, those who rush to volunteer to help immediately after the 7th of October. Like the whole protest movement transformed itself to a civil rescue movement immediately on the 7th of October. I saw it in front of my eyes, I took part in it. We volunteered for weeks because the government was not in the game, was not in the event, was thunderstruck. This is Israeli civil society. It's not the Israeli left, as political rivals put it. It is Israeli civil society on the march in the street. We might disagree about some things. Not all of us marching on the streets would join me for the two-state solution. Eventually, not now, but later. But this is Israeli civil society, and you need, perhaps for the first time in your history as a Jewish community abroad, to choose what colors are your flag, the governments, the Israeli governments, or civil societies. Yes, the split is real. And I think the split will partially heal in the next election round, which is why in the rallies we are calling for elections as soon as possible.
Thank you. We had a question about, we had a few questions, but one of them, because I can see we don't have much time yet, and I'm going to keep a couple of minutes for myself for my last question. We had a question about the drafting of the Haredi drafting bill, and I wondered whether you had any, the question really was any brief reflections from you on that.
I have a very clear view. Civic duties like civil rights should be equal. Both Haredim and Arab citizens should serve in some way, civil, if not military. And I think all those Haredi young men, we are talking about tens of thousands. Very soon it will be 100,000 young men who are exempt from service because they're studying the Torah. This is civically wrong. This is wrong in terms of liberalism. Liberalism is not to allow them to run their course, especially not such a huge minority, but to demand not only to give, to demand duties, not only to give rights. And on a cultural level, you may know that, yes, you do know, I think, we spoke about it, that my late father and I co-authored a book called Jews and Words about 10 years ago, in which we proudly raise our own banner of secular Jewishness, Judaism, but I don't like the ism, so Jewishness, and say that being a secular Jew is just as Jewish, to put it mildly, as being Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox or this and that. I will no longer, I and people like myself in Israel will no longer have the Haredim looking down upon me, in my case also as a woman, but especially as a secular Jew, and saying, no, you guys are not Jewish enough. We are the real Jews. We are praying for you. This is our job because we are better Jews. No, guys, you are not better Jews, and you need to be in uniform just like me. If I served for 2 years in the Israeli army and then did miluim, reserve duty, and so on, you should and can do it too. And if not the women, because they are so holy and pure, the ultra-Orthodox young ladies, then at least the men. We need you in the Israeli army. And if this is going to be a culture war, which I think it is, it will need to be handled cautiously, tactfully, has been cautious and tactful so far to no avail, but also assertively. We need the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi young men in uniform soonest. It's a military need, but above all, it is a social, civil need. If we don't want Israel to fall into its constituent parts, those maps where they show you different parts of Israel, why not divide the place between right, left, and ultra-Orthodox? We can't, not least because the liberal center-left is paying for most of the others. Is working and paying taxes and keeping up most of the others.
In terms of, you mentioned the sector, the different segmentations, and I wanted to ask you to kind of bring full circle in some ways back to kibbutz. You mentioned that you were in a kibbutz youth movement in Hanoah Ha'aved. You were born on kibbutz Huldah. And I think for many years, maybe kibbutzim were not as strongly in the collective consciousness in Israel as they had been in the country's foundation. But certainly from reasons of horrific trauma, they are now because they took such significant loss. And I just wondered if you had reflections on what that could mean for Israeli society moving forward. Or right now?
That's a wonderful question to end with, unless we still have time for the questions and answers that have accumulated. But let me just say that not only because the kibbutzim were victims are they back in the public discourse after the 7th of October, but also because they are so wonderful as communities after the calamity, because of the solidarity, because they were evacuated together as communities, not as individuals, because they support each other and even have time to support Israeli society, because kibbutzim are a wonderful invention, which we now understand all too well. Not the old post-communist equality, which was very important, is now less so, but the sharing, the community, the togetherness, the support, the solidarity. Kibbutz Nir Oz, which was the worst hit, not by total, but by relative numbers. Terrible thing happened. The Shoah happened to Kibbutz Nir Oz. And they were speedily evacuated on the 7th, though, the survivors. A week later, the kibbutz CEO, the kibbutz member, she's a wonderful woman, she wrote to all the creditors of the kibbutz, to the people doing business, to the suppliers, please bear with us, we will pay you what we owe you in a couple of weeks, and so they did. This is a kibbutz. This is the spirit. and they're badly beaten. I have friends in Be'eri, I have friends in the other kibbutzim. It's horrible, but it shows for generations to come the strength of the kibbutz, and already young people, friends of my sons, I can see that, are seriously considering, and some have already registered, applied to join kibbutzim. It is not the end of the kibbutz. It is, strangely enough, tragically enough, perhaps even a new beginning for the kibbutz and for the kibbutz movement.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I feel like that really leads me to something that's been sitting on my mind, and I feel like maybe you're perfectly placed to answer. If you talked about a resurgence of the kibbutz movement, you talked about leadership and critiqued the leadership in, or at least the government in Israel at the moment. And I wondered about, at this point, after 75 years of Israel, that if you're talking about a new kind of leadership, what might that look like in Israel? What would the leadership, whether it's from civil society, whether it's from young people, whether it's from whoever it comes from, what might a new definition of leadership, Israel's famous for being the startup nation, innovative. So if something new can come from anywhere, it can probably come from Israel. So what could we expect and hope to see?
Well, I'm expecting, and again, I'll be very practical about it, some of the leaders of the old moderate right, such as Bennett, Lapid, who is more right than left, maybe Saar, people I would never vote for, but I respect them, and I think they're democratic and moral. To team up with new leaders from the center-left. There is the new center-left party, Zionist left party, the Democrats, former Labor and Meretz, headed by Yair Golan. Yair Golan is an impressive leader. I still do not know what his political talents are, and you need a lot of political talent in Israel in order to survive and flourish. But a teaming up of the Zionist left, the center and moderate right, non-Bibist right, and hopefully of an Arab party or two. And we've already seen an Arab party in the coalition of Bennett and Lapid, and it worked very well. It was very reassuring. So maybe Mansour Abbas's party, maybe another Arab party joining the coalition of a declaration of inner Israel unity can be a very good future coalition. It might disagree about the end game, about the future solution for Israel and Palestine, but it will not disagree on bringing back society and conversation to a reasonable course of stopping the so-called poison machine, which is mainly from the extreme right and from the government circle these days. To talk more respectfully, to debate more respectfully, and to reach pragmatic decisions about the future. That's all I'm asking of a future Israeli coalition. And of course, returning some dignity and cleaning the stables or excluding the corruption that we are seeing now in several government offices, and letting civil society flourish, letting the society economy flourish again. This is my hope for the immediate future for Israel.
I wanted to thank you because we're about to finish, and I feel like the wish for civil conversation in the town square, that wish for civil conversation, I feel like I can broaden selfishly and take outside of Israel as well. Wishing for Israel to have it, but also wishing for that, even aside from debates about Israel throughout the world in many other countries. I think that that's a really a good way to finish. And I really want to thank you so much for your time in coming back home to Australia.
Thank you so much. And I apologize to all the viewers who asked questions. We didn't get to many of the questions. You can find me very easily online, hunt me down and send me your questions. And thank you all for joining in. Thanks for having me. Later.
Bye, everyone. Bye.